In the 1970s, General Motors built an engine that defined the sound of the American highway. It was loud, it was fast, and it was everywhere. But this machine had a fatal flaw. It was the only machine in history that could commit suicide. Mechanics called it the Runaway. It would rev uncontrollably until it physically exploded. It leaked oil in every parking lot, and the federal government spent 20 years trying to ban it. But paper doesn't kill iron. From the glider kit loophole to the U.S. military, this is the story of the Detroit Diesel 8V92, the engine that refused to die. Back in the 60s, GM wasn't just a company, they owned the road. But even an empire has to deal with the law. A mess of state regulations put a hard clamp on tractor trailer length, 55 feet bumper to bumper. If you wanted to make money, you needed to maximize the trailer. That squeezed the tractor down to a 10-foot box. This created a serious packaging problem. Drivers were screaming for high horsepower to haul heavy loads, a job usually reserved for the massive Detroit Diesel 12V71. But the V12 was a monster. At 99 inches long, it physically wouldn't fit inside the short cab-over frames the law demanded. Drivers wanted torque, but the DOT only left room for a V8. The fix came from James E. Knott, the boss at Detroit Diesel. He had Cummins breathing down his neck and a simple order for his team: pack V12 Power into a V8 footprint. They called the strategy power density. Knott and his crew took their old reliable, the Series 71, and bored it out to the absolute limit. They punched the cylinder bores from 4.25 inches out to 4.84 inches. They carved out the block to increase displacement by 30%, jumping from roughly 71 to 92 cubic inches per cylinder. That aggressive machining allowed the new 8V92T to hit 475 horsepower. It matched the big V12s, but it weighed just 2,400 pounds and fit in the same hole as a standard V8. But the real kicker wasn't the size, it was the cycle. The 8V92 was a two-stroke. Unlike a four-stroke that wastes time on intake and exhaust, the Detroit fired every single time the piston hit the top. To make that happen, it used a massive gear-driven roots blower sitting right on top of the block. A lot of guys think the blower is there for high performance boost. Well, it's not. On a Detroit, that blower is a lung. The piston can't suck in air on its own, so the blower force feeds oxygen into the cylinder through ports machined right into the liner walls, physically shoving the spent exhaust out. Because the piston rings have to cross those open ports on every stroke, the engine consumes oil by design. You pull that blower, and the engine doesn't just lose power, it becomes a paperweight. That cycle created a sensory trick. At 2100 RPM, the 8V92 fires 8 times per revolution. That creates a frequency of 280 Hz. To make that same pitch, a four-stroke would have to spin at 4200 RPM. It was a mechanical illusion that made the truck sound like it was tearing a hole in the sky, even if it was just doing the speed limit. On paper, the 8V92 was the answer. It beat the red tape, but you don't get something for nothing. By boring out the cylinders to chase horsepower, engineers had shaved the block walls razor thin. They traded iron for power, and that set the stage for a disaster just as the economy was about to tank. In 1974, GM rolled out the Series 92. They slapped a coat of paint on it and called it the Green Engine. The sales guys promised better fuel economy and cleaner emissions to beat the new federal regs choking the industry. It was supposed to be the heir to the throne, the evolution of the unkillable 71 series that built this country. But out in the real world, the only thing green about this engine was the puddle of antifreeze it left in every parking lot it visited. To understand the disaster, you have to look at the iron. The old Series 71 used dry liners. The cylinder liner sat inside a solid block bore, safe and dry. But to chase that power density in the 92, engineers switched to wet liners. In this design, the coolant flows right against the outside of the liner to shed heat faster. It works on paper, but on the road, the 92's thin block walls flexed under the torque. This caused the liners to vibrate against the block, a problem called fretting. That vibration chewed up the rubber O-rings meant to seal the coolant. Once those seals go, pressurized antifreeze sprayed right into the oil pan. It turned the oil into a corrosive gray sludge that wiped out the bearings. Brand new engines were spinning bearings before the first oil change. But leaks were just a nuisance. The 92 had a much scarier habit: the runaway. In a modern electronic truck, if a sensor fails, the computer shuts the engine down. Safe, boring, but a Detroit is purely mechanical. Fuel is delivered by a rack, a solid metal bar connecting all the injectors. If just one injector plunger seized, usually from gummed up varnish or moisture, it acted like an anchor. It locked the whole rack at full fuel. The governor couldn't pull it back. There is no panic like sitting in a cab over a V8 that has decided to commit suicide. When a Detroit runs away, it screams toward its physical breaking point. Turning the key off does nothing. The engine doesn't need a spark. It just needs air and fuel. In the worst cases, if the seals were shot, the engine would start sucking its own lube oil through the blown blower seals. It would run until it exploded or ran dry. The only way to kill it was to choke it out. You had to trigger the flapper, a spring-loaded guillotine in the air intake. You had to be brave enough to reach down and trip that latch while a grenade was spinning at 4,000 RPM right next to your hip. The timing couldn't have been worse. GM dropped this fragile, thirsty engine right as the 1973 oil crisis hit. Diesel jumped from 38 cents to over 53 cents overnight. Then came the double nickel, the 55 mph speed limit. That speed limit was a death sentence for the 8V92. These two-strokes were designed to run against the governor, screaming at high RPM to be efficient. Forcing them to lug along at 55 mph fouled them up and killed their mileage. The name Green Leaker stuck. Large fleets, the backbone of GM's empire, felt betrayed. Dealership lots filled up with dead rows, lines of trucks parked for weeks, waiting for warranty engines. The market share GM had held since World War II began to crack. Fleet managers stopped laughing at the heavy, boring four-strokes from Cummins and Caterpillar and started writing checks. GM had built a monster. It was loud, loose, and bleeding cash. To save the division, they had to stop chasing theoretical horsepower and fix the metal. They needed a redesign that would eventually paint over the green failure with a new shade of silver. By 1981, Detroit Diesel was drinking at the Last Chance Saloon. They had one shot to fix the reputation of the Green Leaker, or the division was dead. The answer was the Silver 92. This wasn't just a paint job. Engineers went to war with the hardware. They hunted down every weak point that had embarrassed them in the 70s and didn't stop until the engine was bulletproof. First, they tackled the leaks. They threw out the old rubber seals and replaced them with Viton O-rings. This was aerospace materials originally developed for the Venus space probe. It could handle the heat and the vibration without cracking. Next, they fixed the breathing. They standardized high-efficiency aftercoolers, tucking them neatly under the blower right in the engine's valley. This cooled the intake air down, making it denser. Denser air means a bigger bang and cooler internal temperatures. But the real game changer was the crosshead piston. The old one-piece pistons would expand under heat and seize up in the bore. The crosshead was a two-piece design. It allowed the crown to take the punishment of combustion while the skirt stayed cool and stable. You could finally run the engine hard without worrying about welding the pistons to the liners. And you had to run it hard. The Silver 92 still demanded a specific type of operator. You couldn't lug a Detroit like a lazy four-stroke Cummins. If you let the RPMs drop, you lost your air pressure. To make power, you had to drive it like you hated it. You kept your foot pinned against the governor, slamming gears only when the needle hit the red line. This aggressive style birthed the gear jammer culture, and the soundtrack to that culture was the Jacobs engine brake. On a four-stroke, a Jake brake makes a low, rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum. But on a Silver 92, the brakes sounded like ripping canvas. Because the two-stroke cycle releases compressed air twice as often per revolution, it doubled the frequency of the gunshot sound. It sounded like a 50 cal machine gun going off under the hood. It was a noise so aggressive that small towns across America put up signs banning compression braking just to get some sleep. Despite the noise complaints, or maybe because of them, the Silver 92 became a legend. It didn't just rule the highway, it owned the city. GM designed their famous RTS buses around the compact Detroit V-block. They used a unique V-drive configuration mounted transversely in the back. The long inline-six engines from the competition physically couldn't fit. If a city wanted modern buses, they had to buy Detroit diesel. For a whole generation, the sound of a city bus wasn't a hum, it was the scream of a two-stroke 6V92. The Silver Series had redeemed the brand on American soil. They had the trucks, they had the buses, and they had the military. But GM got greedy. They wanted to take this American brawler and turn it into a global standard. But as executives looked across the Atlantic, they were about to find out that American horsepower doesn't always translate. The 8V92 ruled the American interstate, but when Detroit Diesel tried to ship that iron overseas, they learned a hard lesson. Geography dictates the machine. The engine was a brute force solution, and it needed a specific kind of world to survive. Nowhere was this clearer than the split between Australia and Europe. Down under, the Screamin Jimmy didn't just survive, it found a spiritual home. The Australian outback is a logistical nightmare that breaks lesser engines. Truckers there run road trains, massive rigs pulling 3 or 4 trailers, grossing over 100 tons, crossing desert where the tarmac melts and the nearest mechanic is a day's drive away. The 8V92 became a legend there because of the two-stroke cycle. At Redline, that engine is firing 16,800 times a minute. That creates a continuous wall of torque. It stopped the violent driveline snatching you'd get with a 4-stroke trying to pull 115 tons from a dead stop. To handle the blistering 113-degree heat, they fitted these engines with tropical specs. They used aggressive spider fans and oversized copper and brass radiators to dump the heat. And because the Detroit breathes twice as often, it kept the water pump spinning furiously, moving massive amounts of air through the block. But the real selling point was simplicity. When you are stranded in the Northern Territory, you don't need a laptop. You can't diagnose a microchip with a hammer. The 8V92 was purely mechanical. If it had fuel and air, it would run. But when GM tried to push the 8V92 into Europe, they hit a brick wall. The continent was the exact opposite of the Outback. It was tight, regulated, and expensive. When the Detroit arrived, it ran headfirst into a culture led by Scania and Volvo. Those guys had spent decades refining the 4-stroke diesel, chasing low-end torque and fuel efficiency. To a European eye, the high-revving Detroit looked like a dinosaur. In the tight, echoing streets of European villages, that trademark scream wasn't a badge of honor, it was a noise violation. Regulators erected a wall of silence, enforcing strict noise limits the 2-stroke couldn't meet. To fix it, manufacturers had to encapsulate the engine. They wrapped the block in thick foam panels to stifle the noise. It worked for the sound, but it killed the engine. The foam acted like a blanket, trapping the heat inside. It cooked the starters, melted the wiring harnesses, and ruined the reliability. Then there was the cost. In 1980, European fuel cost nearly 2.5 times what it did in the States. The Detroit returned a dismal 6.62 miles per gallon, while the Scania DS14 was miles ahead. The Detroit was turning expensive diesel into noise and heat, not just horsepower. In the US, that was the cost of doing business. In Europe, it was financial suicide. The 8V92 was a creature of the open road. It was unstoppable on the wide plains of America and the deserts of Australia. But in the tight, regulated jungle of Europe, it suffocated. Geography had fenced the 2-stroke empire in, but while the physical world set its boundaries, a much more dangerous threat was growing in the labs. The mechanical soul of the 8V92 had survived heat, weight, and bad fuel, but it was about to face an enemy that didn't care about torque. The era of the microchip was arriving. By the mid-1980s, the writing was on the wall. GM tried to bridge the gap with the DDEC, Detroit Diesel Electronic Control. To the engineers, it was a masterpiece. To the guys holding the steering wheel, it was a hostile invasion. Drivers looked at DDEC with deep suspicion. For 40 years, the relationship between a trucker and a Detroit was intimate. If the engine acted up in the middle of nowhere, you could fix it with a 9/16 wrench and a working knowledge of the fuel rack. DDEC changed that overnight. It turned the engine into a sealed black box. If it quit, you were a passenger. You didn't need a mechanic anymore, you needed a technician with a laptop. The driver revolt wasn't just about reliability, it was about losing control. They were being demoted from operators to steering wheel holders. While Detroit Diesel was trying to digitize a dinosaur, the competition was stealing their lunch money. Cummins and Caterpillar had spent years perfecting the four-stroke. They built engines that were logical, heavy, boring, and consistent. They didn't have soul, but they also didn't break down every other week. Fleet managers stopped caring about the sound and started looking at the ledger. The numbers were a bloodbath. In the 1970s, Detroit owned 41% of the Class 8 market. By 1987, they were down to 3%. The company wasn't dying, it was already dead. In 1988, GM finally pulled the plug. They sold the rotting division to the one man who might actually fix it, Roger Penske. This wasn't a standard purchase. Penske didn't buy it with a suitcase of cash. He took on the debt. GM effectively paid him to haul the trash away. Penske didn't waste time. He knew morale was in the gutter. In a brilliant move, he invited 3,000 employees to the racetrack to watch a Penske car win the Marlboro 500. He put the Detroit Diesel logo on the side of the car and told them, "We are done losing." But Penske was a racer. He knew you can't cheat physics. He looked at the 8V92 and saw a dead end. The problem was scavenging. That violent, messy two-stroke process blows unburned fuel and oil right out of the stack. The EPA was tightening the noose on nitrogen oxide, NOx. You simply could not make a high-output two-stroke clean enough to survive the 1990s. He needed a new weapon. He took the remaining capital and bet the farm on a radical new project, the Series 60. Now here's a detail most people miss. The Series 60 has John Deere DNA. GM and Deere had a failed merger back in '86, but the blueprints for the cylinder head survived. Penske took that tech and ran with it. The Series 60 was the executioner. It was a clean-sheet inline-six four-stroke. It was the first heavy-duty engine with fully integrated electronics, with zero mechanical backup. If the computer died, the truck died. It was quiet, clean, and practical. When it launched, it saved the company from total collapse. But for drivers who had spent their lives shifting gears by the sound of the exhaust, it felt like a betrayal. They had traded the soul of the Screamin Jimmy for survival. The Series 60 was a better engine on paper, but the old iron wasn't ready to be forgotten. Detroit shut down the two-stroke line decades ago, but paper doesn't kill iron. If you stand near a highway long enough today, you will still hear it. That high-frequency drone cutting through the low rumble of modern traffic. The 8V92 entered its zombie era, surviving in places where the EPA couldn't reach it, or where mechanics found a way around the rules. Uncle Sam kept the 8V92 on life support long after the civilians moved on. The Oshkosh Hemet is the backbone of American logistics. In a war zone, nobody cares about emissions. They care about miles per breakdown. A modern engine has sensitive fuel pumps that die if you look at them wrong, but the Detroit's mechanical injectors will digest JP8 jet fuel without complaint. More importantly, it's EMP-proof. An electromagnetic pulse or a bad sensor can brick a modern plastic truck computer, but the mechanical version of the 8V92 has no brain to fry. As long as the starter turns and the fuel rack's open, the engine fires. It was the apex predator for the apocalypse. On the water, the legend was even louder. Marine builders like Johnson & Towers took the 8V92 and tuned it to a staggering 800 horsepower. They earned the nickname hand grenades. Yacht owners accepted a brutal trade. You got to the fishing grounds first, but your engine needed a rebuild every 1,500 hours, barely a summer season. It was a ticking time bomb of performance that no modern diesel could match for the price. But the real rebellion happened on the highway. It was called the glider kit. Companies like Fitzgerald in Tennessee saw a loophole. The EPA regulations applied to the new engine's birth date, not the chassis. So they took a brand new truck body, new cab, new frame, new wheels, and dropped in a remanufactured 1998 Detroit two-stroke. This wasn't about saving money. It was about avoiding the new emissions junk. Drivers were sick of DEF fluid, DPF filters, and sensors putting their trucks into limp mode 500 miles from home. A glider gave them a brand new truck with an engine they could fix with a wrench. It was a legal middle finger to the EPA. It worked too well. In 2016, the feds finally stepped in and strangled the supply, capping production to 300 units per manufacturer per year. That number didn't just regulate the industry, it decapitated it. That brings us to the end of the line. We traded soul for efficiency. A modern four-stroke is quiet, smooth, and isolates you from the work. It's like driving a giant refrigerator. The Detroit 8V92 was a partner. You had to watch the pyrometer. You had to feed it straight 40-weight oil. You had to manage the RPMs. You had to drive it. It vibrated the floorboards, shook the fillings out of your teeth, and filled the cab with noise. It was toxic, loud, and physically exhausting to run for 12 hours a day. And we miss it dearly. The story of the Screamin Jimmy is the ultimate trade-off. We got the clean air, and we got the reliability, but we lost the connection to the machine. It marks the last time an engine felt like a living thing, rather than a line of code. Physics won. The government won. But for a few glorious, deafening decades, Detroit put up a hell of a fight. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can still hear that scream echoing off the canyon walls. Now, I want to hear from the veterans. Did you love the scream or did you hate the noise? Did you ever have to trip the air flapper on a runaway? Drop your tales from the road in the comments. And if you want to keep the two-stroke legacy, hit that subscribe button. I'll catch you on the next one.